Good morning. Good morning, friends. We are a small but elite bunch this morning, and we're here to listen to a lively talk, as we always know, by our friend Jenny Smith. This time it is entitled Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. Jenny.
Right. Thank you. I had to think about this and started to go through a lot of diaries. And I thought, actually, the frying pan had a lot more in it before we jump into the fire. So I'm probably going to offer you another 2 talks afterwards and try and do the frying pan bit. I started to also realize that right from doing my placement for my CQSW, I'd been in and out of prisons for various reasons, visiting people. Also, when I eventually got Southmead as a caseload, I had to learn all sorts of things like advising people on how to go and get transport to get them to Dartmoor. And I was adopted by, because I was helping lots of prisoners, I was adopted by a prison organisation that was in Bath that befriended prisoners and helped them when they took their first steps out of prison. They found I was very useful for information about where possibly to get a roof over their head, but also to get them back into the living world and employment. And it happened by default. It was really strange. It was like, I did wonder sometimes whether God had his hand in them or her hand in the middle of all this. And suddenly something was dropped on my doorstep or came into the surgery. And I had to learn. And I was constantly learning about procedures and things. So I'm going to talk to you now about the frying pan a bit more. Because I was in and out of prisons, I visited Vinnie Green prison. I knew all about the women's prison out in South Gloucester. And that's where some of us on the community council, which I was on for a while, really got upset about women that were pregnant having babies in prisons. And we really didn't think that was right for the woman. And it wasn't right for a child to have on its birth certificate where it actually had got born, carried that for the rest of its life. So we talked to Jean Corsten and gave her all the information and sat back, and she started taking action to research and look at the whole of the system in depth in the House of Commons where she was then. As a councillor as well, I seemed to get people walk in from other parts of North Bristol. I had to convince them that I wasn't their councillor, and their councillor might get very, very upset by coming to me. But if it was urgent, I did do something for them, maybe a letter, maybe advise them where to go and get help, but ensured that the councillor that they should have gone to knew that I'd picked that up by sending a copy, which was quite easier for me, because inside the council, all us councillors knew each other. Yes, I'm going to say, I also was friendly with our Quaker friend who was a governor out at Pucklechurch, and went in to talk to him about prisons because I thought he would have some information and help that I would need, because I was picking quite a lot of it up. And I'm not telling you that Southmead were full of ex-prisoners. It wasn't. But for some unknown reason, I got onto a hidden grapevine that existed. And they were coming into my surgery from all the surrounding area. I don't know how that happened. It just did. And eventually I went out to Ley Hill. And while I was working for shelter, I went out to Ley Hill prison and actually talked to lifers that were about to come out of prison about what benefits didn't exist anymore, what benefits there were, and how the world that they went in prison to about 20 years before was a completely and utterly different world to the one they were going to come out with into. None of the, I never planned my life. It happened. It walked in the door to me, and I suddenly found out what was going on. As you know, I got deselected from Henbury after 8 years, and suddenly there was a shout in the Labour group, and Graham, your wife was part of it. We must keep her. She's our gypsy policy. So Valerie worked very hard, I know, and others did. And suddenly I was going for an interview to Southmead. And I really wondered about that, because it was still a long way away from where I lived, but a community I knew very little about, except it had a terrible reputation, which I later found really wasn't true. It was just another part of the city that was struggling, people trying to keep their heads above the water, despite what was going on in Parliament and among the ordinary world around them. I liked Southmead people very much. Southmead had only ever kept a councillor for 4 years at a time, and then they kicked them out. So the PA for the Tory party was absolutely amazed after 4 years when I got reselected again and got back into Southmead. He said that had never happened before. And what did you do? Nothing, I've no idea. But from then on, I ended up doing 23 years in Southmead, and I stood down. I didn't get kicked out, which was interesting because Southmead were teaching me. Sometimes councillors aren't the teachers, you know. We know things, but we know things about a very austere world. But your electorate teaches you all sorts of things you would never have learned any other way. And you learnt in one of my other talks about how I knew how to break into a car. And that was just getting locked out of my own car. I was shown how to get back into it. And things like that come up. So I suppose, yes, there are parallel worlds running alongside us, you know, in this city. And I don't think most people realise that. They know their own little bit, and they don't realise how other people are surviving. Kingswood schools had closed as a detention centre, and we opened a new one out at Vinnie Green. And I participated in the Layview review of Vinnie Green and how it was built, and hoped we were getting it right. And when I went on visits to see the young people there, I don't think we did. We got yet another prison. And education is sparse in those prisons. It's very structured to be boring, and the youngsters kick off on a regular basis. I think I told you that the one that I went to in Kingswood, the youth prison there, they bored holes through the walls into each other's room cells. And the whole place was a rabbit warren. They had to pull it down eventually. Youngsters get up to all sorts of things behind the scenes. as I said, I was on the Community Health Council and had been for a long time. And I was also on Southmead Health Authority, which was really interesting because cuts were going through with services, and we were, as elected members, expected to agree with some of the new practices that were being proposed. And I better tell you who Sue Davidson was. Sue Davidson was the secretary, the wife of the secretary of the Southmead Labour Party. Her husband was Colin, and they were absolutely stalwarts of helping people sort their lives out. Colin, who was an electrician and worked in the building trade, often got young people, especially boys, in Southmead into apprenticeships, got them trained and got them out to a life where they weren't going to commit crimes. I always thought that Colin was wonderful, and so was Sue. Anyway, on the Southmead Authority, they set up a questionnaire, and I was all over the press refusing to take part in the questionnaire because it was about rationing services. And I said, you can't ration and say this group of people can't have this medical thing because it's in spite of it being a necessity for them. And it was the NHS struggling with finance. Does it ring a bell today? They're still in trouble. I'd like to know whether they're doing questionnaires to their members to see if they will agree to cuts in services and changes. Sue and I were all over the papers, absolutely refusing to go on with it, which embarrassed them left, right and centre. I couldn't have been an easy person to have as a councillor in any area, because there were things that I wasn't going to go along with. We had some laughs too. We were out canvassing. Eventually Peter Hammond was elected as the other councillor for Southmead. So he and I had to work together, which worked fine for both of us. But we were out canvassing in Trowbridge Road one day, and there were two men, one sitting on one of these concrete mushrooms that you have outside in gardens. And we said, it's elections tomorrow, will you be voting for it? And he said, no, I'll be in prison tomorrow. He was going to court the next day, and he knew he was going to go down. And they were very friendly, the people of Southmead, although some of them weren't. There was one family that had lots and lots of children in Ringwood Crescent, and Dad was in and out of prison all the time. Mum didn't seem to know how to bring up children anyway, so they were running wild. And the lovely old couple of elderly people that lived opposite were actually feeding these children. And then the children started stealing from them, so they had to stop that. Things like this, it brought out the best in people and the worst in people in areas such as Southmead. And I know Hartcliffe's the same, because my casework with shelter took me into Knoll West, took me into Hartcliffe, took me into places in the city where other people would never go. And I remember being down in City Road in a cellar, visiting a West Indian man because the place was damp, and there was a load of Rastafarians in there, young men. And they said, I started doing my job, and they said, you've worked with us before, haven't you? You're not frightened of us, are you? And I said, no, I'm doing my job. Anyway, I did the same outside the Black and White Cafe on Grosvenor Road. I was inspecting a house opposite about the time it hit all the headlines of how terrible and what drugs were going on and all the rest of it. And it was for two young girls that were terrified of actually go on to Grosvenor Road opposite the Black and White Cafe. And I did the inspection. They were going to have the flat on the top floor. And in the end, the girl turned around and said, I've never had so much fun in all my life. Because the young men from opposite were coming into the flat and helping me. Here's a bit of mould, Jenny. Look, this window's not in properly, Jenny. And I think that that's what you do in communities like that. You relax. You become the mate rather than the authoritarian person that's coming into them. And you're the help, because you can talk to them like a Dutch uncle and get away with it. I liked the people on my caseload, not all of them. Some of them were horrendous. But a lot of people in this city have golden hearts, and they are really often very much maligned. I think it's a need for mixtures of people to mix together a lot more. So I've told you that it's somewhere. I've got the press cuttings of Sue and I hitting the press together. The Greenway Trust was set up while I was there at the beginning. And it was set up because Greenway School had been shut down and was no longer a boys' school, which it had been in the past. And there were problems with money. There was also problems with the first management, where there were debts and things disappearing, and it wasn't quite managed properly. And we managed to sort that out. And today, if you go out there, Greenway is very well managed, very well looked after, and has moved on. And it's about unwinding things like that and ensuring certain people aren't able to have complete control over any organisation anywhere, that they work in teams together. Had a bit of trouble with the youth centre too. It's one of the best youth centres there is in the city now, with all its climbing frames and things. And I think I've told you about what was happening to the hospital, and the fact that the operating theatre's blood was coming out in the trim down through Southmead. And when I raised it publicly and started fighting back, everyone was trying to cover it up. And I was at a meeting, and the Tory from Westbury-on-Trim turned around and said, she's making this up. And one of the officers said, I wish she was. You talk about polluted water today. What was going into our water when I arrived in Bristol was horrendous. It wasn't just that hospital. It was all the hospitals, but it was also the paperworks and all the other industry that existed originally in Bristol. They didn't think twice about dumping anything straight into the water system. Nowadays, we have stricter rules, but they weren't there then. It was a different time. And under the agreement from Greenway Trust that sold off some of their land to be a centre with a swimming pool and other activities which exist today, there was an agreement that the children in Southmead could use it for school during the day, so that they could go for swimming lessons there and things. The multimillionaire in charge of that wouldn't do it, hung around all the time avoiding the situation, although it was part of the original agreement. And then he contacted one of the senior officers of the city council, not us, because by that time I was one of the members of the Greenway Committee, and said, I'm on the beach in Bermuda, I think it must have been, and I've made a decision that no, the youngsters can't use all those our swimming facilities and things in his thing that he just built. So he gazumped on the agreement. I went in with David about 2 weeks back, I think, David, we were there. And one of the members there asked me about it, and I told him all the information that I knew and how there had, yes, been an agreement that the school children could have swimming lessons in those facilities, and that the multimillionaire in charge of it had decided to break the agreement. And of course, a city council or the community associations would never have money sufficiently to cover it, a court case. So there was nothing else we could do. You can understand now that I'm a person that's very careful about actually talking about some things that's happened in my life, because I have been there. I told you I've had a knife held at my stomach. And so I talked him out a bit, told him I knew his mum, and she was a lovely human being. And what would happen if you do that to me? She'd have to live through a court case that would be terrible for her. And it worked. But sometimes you can't do that fast enough. Yeah. Before I stopped working for Shelter, I started to organise a count of the homeless in the city. Hilary Gilmore, who's now, I think she's called Saunders now, you know, David. She and I were working on it, and we got lots and lots of volunteers coming out of all sorts of parts of the city. And what we were saying to them is, we know places where the homeless are at night hiding, and we gave them tips of where to look, and carried out this massive survey of the city. And that was 86. And we wrote a report on it afterwards with the numbers that had been found and where. That really had upset London office. London office said, we only help people who are roofless. You have produced people that live in garages. The people that were in the old tunnels under St Mary Redcliffe, we counted them. We counted people under motorway arches. They had a roof over their head. And they were really, really annoyed about the report that we compiled. Oh, and we counted people that were living in cars and in caravans, wherever they were on the streets. And it was a massive count. And I think today there is this blockage, even in the city council. If you've got a roof over your head, you're all right, although it's not a legitimate roof. I really wondered how far that would go, but we got our knuckles rapped definitely over that from London office. And I think the report might be somewhere in the archives of the museum archives, but it died a death because London office didn't agree with it. And that was when Louise Casey first started working as a director in London. So I'd had sort of a run-in with Louise Casey long before she got round to giving me the push. Just before this, we had a new person put in charge of us in the Shelter office, who was Hindu. I won't tell you who she was, because she's still around. But Hindus believe that gypsies and travellers are the untouchables. History proves that not all of them are. Some might be. But a lot of them were the slaves from Constantinople when they were freed by the Muslims that won the city. Muslims don't have slaves, or didn't have slaves in those days. And they let them all go free, but an awful lot of them ended up in abject poverty, no food, no roof, no nothing. And they all mixed in. And I think if you start doing DNAs of gypsies and travellers, you will find the people have come from those groups on and off for centuries. Perhaps left over from wars, perhaps left over from something else that had going on at the time. But it made a difference to the atmosphere in the office, because I was dealing with people who weren't the right caste, if you know what I mean. So I got another difficulty. I know why I got pushed out of shelter. I was picking up an information and highlighting it that they really didn't want out in public arena. Also, I was a member of the National Council of Civil Liberties and used to go to meetings in Bristol. I did object to them thinking about getting younger people into allowed to have sex at a very young age. And it was one of the things that some of them were fighting for at that time. I felt that maturity should be about 15 or 16, and that was a good thing, because young children really couldn't make up their minds about that. And I was an observer at the demonstrations for Reclaim the Streets in Bristol. I was the observer on the M32. The police knew I was there. As you remember, I was on the police authority, and I made absolutely sure they knew that I had a role. People in the demonstration had my phone number, and so did the police. And I had to walk right through the police lines on the M32 to tell the police, would you please get a pregnant woman out of the demonstration, and showed them which group she was with, because she had just broken her waters and we weren't going to have a baby born straight in the middle of the M32. And such was life. But that, I think that also brought me closer to the squatting movement, and they used to ring me up for bits of legal legislation and all sorts of. So I was actually dealing, well, I wasn't dealing with, I was associating with people in the city that many don't ever go anywhere near. And at Temple Meads at the flyover, I walked through police lines to tell them that the mothers with the babies and the children that were being kettled were very worried and would like to come out. And the treasurer of the then Bristol City Council, I will remember his name one time, I saw him the other day, he was standing there really worried about one of his city councillors walking through police lines all alone, a woman. But it worked. They let them out, and we got the children back to their mums to go home to a more normal place, not being kettled. I also came across, these are all because I'm looking at diaries. David White was Euro MP at the time, and he was the one that investigated pollution of water in our taps at home, because we had turned taps on and had bubbles coming out of it. And today we roughly have got nowhere, because we're still having pollution of water, aren't we? And haven't moved on. During 1996 and 7, I was very sick. I kept having shingles, as you know, and I had all sorts of things go wrong with me. I was going through the change, and I had to fight for HRT. I found out it existed, and I demanded it, and they told me I was going to get cancer and I'd die and it would do terrible things to me. But it did actually make sure I was hanging on to some sort of sanity to do the casework I was doing. And when I was working for Shelter, I worked for some of the most well-known solicitors and barristers. I actually went on a lobby to the head of barristers in London with 2 others, trying to think who they were. I will remember eventually, it'll come back. And we actually lobbied for an alternative legislation for gypsies and travellers against the act that was going through then. And when we talked to the barrister in charge, he said, well, give us the writing and tell us what we should do. So one of the people that was with me was actually a minister from Salisbury. And I, and this, why can't I remember the other one? It will come, don't worry, it's there somewhere. We actually sat down together and produced some legislation, a bit of an act of parliament, and we sent it in. And then the bank holiday arrived and Parliament shut down, and then Parliament opened up in September and got back on its feet. And the legislation that was being proposed out of the Labour Party was the one we had done with a few bits of tinkering. So we knew that we were trying to get through it in a different way. You couldn't choose a life like this, could you, really? I rarely tell people because I think they'd run away from me. The solicitors I knew Richard Nile, Kathy's husband, Brian Cox, Bobbitt McCann's, there was a nice woman there, and Brown's on Grosvenor Road. And we were just friends, really. I was ringing them up and sending them a case when I thought that the shelter office couldn't do the work. It obviously needed the professionals in. And I know that if you ask Richard Nile who it was, a barrister came down from London, and Richard and Kathy asked me for a meal with them to meet him, because he wanted to know what I was like, because he'd heard about me. And I didn't know what I was like. I just knew I didn't like injustice. I think that's what you would call it. Let's sort things out. Let's sort messes out and put people back on their own feet. And I never stayed close to people after I'd helped them. I always felt that was their life, not my life, and to let them go. And I always felt very embarrassed if they ever tried to thank me. It was just my job. Yes, so I worked alongside national barristers. I went on training through Shelter with solicitors, and I went to conferences with solicitors. So, yes, and when I came back from one of the ministries, I think it was planning ministry, where gypsies and traveller legislation came from, I didn't say a word while the minister was talking to the people I was with, not a word, but I was taking notes. And on the way back, I wrote the press flyer. But the minister obviously knew who I was. And he said, "You, young lady, aren't going to get the changes you want. Well, some of them came through, not all. And I was having leaks as well from people in Dorset who'd gone for interviews for the Gypsy Liaison Officer for that area. And they had given me all the paperwork from that, which roughly acknowledged that they were going to break the law to get rid of the gypsies and travellers out of their area. Very unwise of them, because I made absolutely sure that went back to people who could do something about it. And I spoke at Glastonbury a number of times about traveller communities being treated, and at Hyde Park in London. On the way up, I stopped behind a traveller van, which the police had stopped. And suddenly the police left. I think they took my registration number down and thought, no, we're not going to have that today, and went off. But I spoke when I got to Hyde Park, on Hyde Park. So I've actually done that. And I actually got a Chief Constable of Avon into court, and it wasn't my fault, really. It wasn't intended, it happened. What happened was I went in to pick up my paperwork on Avon County Council in my pigeonhole. And at the same time, I had my own home letters I picked up, and I went into shelter and all the work was there. So I sorted them out on the table and started sorting out what I should be doing for work that day. And among it was a flyer that had been put out to the police on the South Gloucester evictions. And it mentioned somebody very nastily, defamatory. So I sent him the copy and said, you know, I never read you like this. You're not this sort of person. And the Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset ended up in court. So, but it's what goes on behind scenes sometimes is more dangerous and misinforming than the truth. And the truth is absolutely essential. Oh, and we ran a fringe meeting at the Labour Party conference in Blackpool. No, it was Brighton, sorry. And that was hilarious. All the traveller leaders, after we run the fringe meeting, we went out for a meal. All the travellers were there. There was lots of banter. Two chairs of major trade unions were also at that meal because they supported what we were trying to do, which was get people a settled site to put their vans on, get the children into education, get healthcare on site. We had all the issues under the sun. Anyway, it was hilarious that evening. And I know Rodney Bickerstaff, who was there, took some of the travellers back to his top grade hotel and let them sleep the night there because it was too late for them to drive back to their places in England where they lived. And they discussed how many caravans they could get into his suite that night, which was, and the next morning when I went to the Labour Party conference, somebody said, what on earth happened last night? They said that people are talking about as the best evening they've ever had, because everybody was, 1 minute it was a story about trade union people, a funny one, and then it was one about gypsies and travellers and the whole thing. And that's the way to make friends, isn't it? That's how you get people listening to you. And it's never planned, it happens. And okay, so I've mixed with very strange people in my life, but I do treasure some of them because I think some of them had the roughest end of the stick and were born into the wrong places where there was no justice. It's about justice, I think. There you are. I think that's it. I'll give you another one later on, I'm sure. I can't hear you.
Uncle Jenny, as usual, a enthralling time you have been having. What, I wonder, would you know which is happening today with the travelling communities? Can we say that anything is more enlightened?
Well, Bristol City have actually earthed everything up under the sun and were evicting people off the gypsy site out at Avonmouth.
What's Crystal City?
Bristol City's got a site out there.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said Brystal.
Yeah, a traveller site. We've also, but the ones that are down in Bedminster, there's 2 lots in Bedminster. One are ex people that ran fairs and circuses and things like that. And the other site is a traditional travellers site where traditional travellers site are now settled in and the children are in education. I have learnt that Burnham-on-Sea that have a site, they had a bit of difficulty because the traveller children on those sites who'd been brought up as travellers, when they grew up and had families, were demanding council houses and demanding to get into a roof. So it was settling some of them back into a more normal community. And I did have phone calls too from the New Age travellers about some of their youngsters were also thinking of getting further education to fill in the gaps that they'd lost because of the travelling lifestyle. And I advised some of them to go out to places like Kingswood Education Centre. In fact, I've had a number of people come up to me since I stopped being a counsellor and thanked me for changing their lives. It's very embarrassing. I think, what, who? Not me. But yeah, I had a woman that I had visited her house down in St Paul's, and it was in need of repair, single parent. And I said to her, why don't you do what I did, go back and get educated? And then she stopped me in the city council one day, years later, and said, thank you. She said, I've got a pension, I've got security, I've got my own money. I would never have had that if I hadn't got educated. It's what you do. You just drop the odd bit in and let it nurture and hope it does. But I have had the young ex-traveller children ringing me up, asking me questions, and I still do. But if everybody did that, we would have such a different world.
Same applies to disabled people, really. Thoughtless actions and not knowing what it's like, what people have got to cope with.
Having worked for quite a bit of my life with the problem child, yes, I can understand the attitude sometimes, because as one of my colleagues said, you know, it's very easy, it's easier to understand the handicap, the child who has physical problems. They can be seen and dealt with, but to have a child who constantly screams at you and tells you to fuck off and attacks you and other things like that, you know, this is a problem which is also needed, but is not so nice to deal with, if you get my illusion there. And the same goes for their parents. Working with problem people is always harder if the problem is bad housing, bad education, bad food sometimes, or lack of food, which we are seeing today. And the rise of the food bank is enormous and will continue. And that sounds like Winston Churchill, so I shall stop there.
Will continue.
Some people have a really hard life, don't they? And others make it a hard life.
I was chatting with a couple of volunteers at the, because I volunteer at the Oxfam shop, so I was chatting with a couple of volunteers who were students from China, and they were saying that, yeah, about the problems in China, and I said, but yeah, there are problems over there, but we have different problems in England. And one of them said, yes, she said, somebody I read the other day was earning £2.5 million a year. And she looked at me rather confused and said, how can you spend £2.5 million a year? And I thought, she's about right as well.
Ask Musk.
It's the other end, isn't it? That fear and it will all disappear tomorrow. But then again, I ramble on. Any other thoughts and comments from other friends? Carry on, Hattie.
Jenny, do you know anybody who's sort of doing work like you did then? Anybody who might be sort of doing it now and in the sort of situation where they can actually maybe change things a bit? Anybody we can support like that?
I don't know of anybody. No.
But shelter is obviously you'd support.
Shelter I'd support, yes. But I do think their definition of ruthlessness ought to be challenged sometime, because a bit of corrugated might be a roof, but isn't really. Yeah, I do notice the people begging on the streets. And there was one in Bristol that got himself into the side of the system where hot air was blowing out from the heating from the businesses. And I thought, that's a clever one. You're sitting on the pavement, but you're still getting warm. But there are exceptions.
And yesterday we were at a bus stop, and those ever-changing electronic signs are nice and warm.
Ah, right. Shall we tell them to go and cuddle them?
Yep.
Yeah, no, it shouldn't be.
And also the sleeping pods. Last year and the year before, I helped make some of those.
Yeah.
Each winter. That it's a really lovely voluntary organisation that's putting them together. They do cost quite a lot each, but they are small and portable and in their own bag, and They distribute several hundreds in Bristol, and other cities are making sleeping pods now as well.
What was the organisation, Hattie?
I'll just look it up, but it's about sleeping pods, making them.
Okay.
Sleep pod build. Let's have a look. Hi team. sleeppodbristol@gmail.com.
Okay.
Do they have a website as well?
This is the sign up form. For dreams of a better future, it says.
I do think if you can get out of situations like I was describing, the individuals themselves become stronger, especially if you've encouraged them to do it themselves. I don't believe in this wonderful woman business. I'm not. I'm just a scruffy person, just like the rest of you.
Yeah, sleeppod.org.uk. They also have a Facebook page, Sleep Pod Bristol.
Yeah, it is really a great idea.
So I can't remember if I went this year. They were asking for sign-ups in March. But it was a lovely thing to do. They say they've distributed over 2,500 sleep pods since November 2020 to February 2021. So, wow, that's only a few months. There we go.
You do know all the Gypsies Travellers stuff has gone to the Brotherton Library in Leeds.
Which library?
The Brotherton Library in Leeds. I took 7 carloads up when I stopped working because I was told I could keep it all. The shelter didn't want it. And since then, I've just done about 7 or 8 boxes up again, some more. So, and they're sending me back comments like, this is wonderful, because we went round on sites and did research. We gave them questionnaires. We asked them, how did you get on the road? Were you born here or what? And we started to get in whole life stories. In fact, some of them copied onto bits of paper the questionnaire because they hadn't got enough to go round. And all those are in the Brotherton Library in Leeds.
Wow.
Well, nobody ever asked travellers what's happening.
Unless you got travellers themselves who write it, I would guess it nearly became a secret history of virtually underground people.
Yeah.
You know, living their lives on the margins type of thing.
You do know that I know some Romany, don't you? I can speak Romany a bit. At least I don't starve when I'm among them. And then silly things. I was in the car giving 3 of them a lift back to Bristol one day, and I said my shoes are hurting, and I took the shoes off and threw them at the back and put another pair of shoes on that were, you know, not hurting. And they said, did you know if a woman takes off her shoes in front of you, that means she is interested in marrying you? I said, not me. The things you learn by living among.
Yes, sleeppod.org. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sleeppod.org.uk. Sleeppod is all one word with 2 P's in the middle.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, got that.
Right. I ought to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to me.
Well, thank you for talking. honestly.
Yeah, look forward to hearing you again. Thank you.
Yes, oh, there's lots more, don't worry. Even being a city councillor was interested.
And I assume we would like to make the recording available to other people. Last week's recording has had over 70 views.
Ooh.
Really?
Wow.
Just because it's findable on YouTube.
Mm.
And I think it's good for these things to get out there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll get sued by Shelter, will I?
I don't think so.
No, I don't
David.
tell the truth.
No, it'd be too expensive for them to take you there. They're you know, they're bigger fish at the moment, I'm afraid, Jenny.
These stories should be used for people to learn from and to find ways of making people's lives better, so that people have more opportunity and agency in their lives.
Yeah.
Agreed.
David, what title would you look for on YouTube to view?
I just put the link up for last week's one. If you search on, it was called "Would You Like Cheaper Energy?" So
Oh, would you like?
I think if you put YouTube, "Would you like cheaper energy?" David Saunders, you'll find it. And
Yeah.
incidentally, on that topic, I discovered during the week that Octopus Energy are already offering that if you live near one of their wind turbines, you can join what they call Octopus Fan Club. And if the wind,
Ho.
yeah, right. So if the wind is blowing, you get energy 20% cheaper. If the wind is blowing strongly, you get energy at half price. And I think that's exactly the kind of thing that is going to make renewables, you know, the thing of choice. We were saying that Charles was explaining how it only cost them 4p a unit to make the wind energy, but they couldn't sell it through the grid. But obviously Octopus have figured out how to get this cheaper energy to customers. And if Lawrence Weston can do the same, then I think we will find that we're able to, and if we can do the same thing for solar on roofs, that it can be shared at a discount, then, you know, things will accelerate. And that's, I mean, it's not quite the same as what Jenny's talking about, but putting solar on 90,000 roofs would create a lot of work in the community, and you know that builds the economy, as does halving people's energy bills.
Like to put some solar energy up at Stockwood. There's nothing up here, and it's a high wind. Keep the planes away from the houses, wouldn't it?
You're talking about wind energy then, but there's the possibility to mix wind and solar across the city, and if there's enough of it, then it should result in people having lower energy bills. You know, so you end up with a better economy. At the time that bills are being doubled because of greed, why not start a movement to have bills be halved because of intelligence? And this is the kind of thing that what you've been doing, Jenny, is working with people and helping them figure out how to make their lives better. We just need to make these things more general.
Yeah.
Well, and on that subject, what is next Friday's, Patsy?
Oh, golly. Oh, how embarrassing. I'm so sorry.
Sorry about that.
Has anybody got the newsletter in front of them? The
Did-
notices? It's in the notices?
Is it?
Hold on. All right, give me a sec. Can I have a sec?
Stuart Morton responding to racism. Does that sound? Oh no, that was October.
No.
That was September the 2nd. So,
Two checks. I'm nearly. Oh dear. You don't-
I'm sorry about that.
I'm really sorry. No, it's entirely my fault. Hold on, I'm nearly there. Okay.
well done.
Oh, 4th of November, David Saunders. Do you want to live forever?
Oh, right.
Do you want what?
To live forever.
No,
Oh,
We want to live forever.
no.
There you go.
And then the week after, we've got Graham Davey, the Range Brothers of Friars Central Meeting. Have I got that right? I hope so.
say that again. There's something.
How do I pronounce it, Graham? The Range Brothers
Yeah.
of Friars.
Range Brothers and Town Criers.
No, friars, as in monks and friars.
Yeah.
Right. Lovely.
And then the one after that is Patsy Stadden, A Kind of Homelessness, which is a very elusive sort of title. And then our last one this coming month, we've got Susie Griffin and Mary Bailey talking about the philosophy of yoga.
Great.
Right then, friends. Well, thank you very much for your attendance, and we will see you all next Friday.
Okay, bye.